Awesome. Good morning. Happy Monday. Thank you for being here first thing on a Monday morning. We will go ahead and get started. Again, those of you in the back where I know it's a Monday morning. I know it's hard to show up first thing on a Monday morning. You guys are all welcome to join us at the table if you would like. So we do, as I said earlier, we do have a webinar running. So I do ask if you are going to speak, if you are going to make any comments, please do speak into a microphone so those on the webinar can hear you. And also please state your name before you start making your comments. Speaking of which, my name is Natalie Mast. I am the program manager here at ADWR for working on the management plans. And this is a meeting of the Management Plans Work Group, specifically of the Safe Yield Technical Subgroup. So we are here talking about safe yield in the context of the 5th management plans today. So today's meeting is a little bit of a continuation of a meeting we had a few weeks ago. I believe it was February 2nd. And where we were working through some of the individual components of safe yield. So we're just going to kind of continue that conversation today. We got through all of the inflow side last time, and we'll be working kind of through the outflow side this time. So my name is Natalie Mast. As I said, I would like to introduce just a few ADWR staff that we have here today. At the table next to me is Carol Ward. She is the Deputy Assistant Director for Water Planning and Permitting. That's a mouthful. I think I got it right. And next to her is Einov Henningsen, who is the Active Management Areas Director. On the side, we have one of our management plan staff. That's Amanda Long Rodriguez. And in the back, we have Maggie Martin and, as always, McKenna Welsh running our webinar. So hello to all of them. So we'll go ahead and get started here. Again, we are trying to add at least a little bit of additional detail to our agendas. We post those about a week ahead, and we make sure that there's at least a small description of the topics that we'll be covering at a given meeting when we send out the reminder email ahead of each meeting. Most of you, I think, have seen this before, but just a reminder, we are kind of in the bottom part of this timeline here. Excuse me. Working through, we're taking this calendar year to kind of work through this management plans work group process with the intent of taking 2021 to draft to the 5th management plans and 2022 to adopt those 5th management plans. The idea of that timeline is that those management plans would then become effective, those conservation programs would become effective in 2025. The Management Plans Work Group itself is an ADWR-led stakeholder forum for the development of those plans. So we are here in this process through these meetings to get feedback from you. So this is intended to be an open and collaborative process. As I said earlier, we welcome anyone to come sit at the table. We're really trying to have a conversation about these concepts and get some feedback here. So. For this particular group, we are kind of in this phase of determining the annual calculation for safe yield. So we talked about this a little bit last time that we wanted to start with kind of coming to some consensus on the annual portion of the calculation before moving on to the long-term side of that. And so we're hoping to kind of wrap that annual calculation conversation up today as we work through the outflow section there. And hopefully in the very near future, we can move on to the long-term conversation. I think that'll be interesting. So let's get in there. I mentioned So just to recap just a little bit, the safe yield definition that we're working with is a statutory one, and it does mention both annual portions of that calculation and long-term portions of that calculation. And it's probably important to note that safe yield as defined in the statute is an AMA scale metric. So that's kind of what we're focusing on for the purposes of the 5th management plan. I mentioned at the last meeting, we focused kind of on the inflow side. Today we'll be talking about the outflow side of this annual calculation. For those of you who may be new to this, you can kind of think about this as kind of the pluses and minuses of safe yield. Some things are going into the aquifer, some things are being pumped out of the aquifer, and the balance between those two things is where how we measure overdraft or safe yield. I would like to point out that we have some progress here. So our AMA data page has been updated with a safe yield dashboard thanks to the hard work of McKenna. So please take some time to check that out. I don't think the data set is up yet. It is up? Okay. Perfect. So that data set will be up very soon, but the dashboard itself is already on the website. So we're really excited about that. We feel like that's really good progress. It's kind of a neat tool. If we have time at the end of the meeting, I'll pull that up and we can kind of run through some of the details there. But I just wanted to give you guys a heads up that that is available now. We would absolutely welcome, as you guys are kind of looking at that, digging through that, we would absolutely welcome any feedback, any ideas for how to improve on it or expand upon it. We think it's a really good step in the right direction, but we know there's always ways that we can do better. So, all right. Okay, so before I jump right into our individual components here, does anybody have any questions or comments on kind of the work we've done so far, or the data, or kind of more general safe yield type questions before I jump in? No? Might be a quiet meeting today. That's all right. Okay, let's go ahead and jump right in. So the first outflow item that we're going to talk about today is groundwater outflow. So this particular, let me back up for a second. I should note that there is, I know I showed that list of components on the slide just a couple minutes ago, but that same list is on the back side of your agendas for your reference as we kind of work through this. Again, we are working through the outflows side today, and we're just going to go component by component to kind of check in about each individual component and see if there's any questions and see if there's any consideration of different approaches that we should be taking to any of these individual components. So groundwater outflow is kind of a general category. This particular item is an output of ADWR's regional groundwater models. And this specifically refers to natural types of outflow. Sometimes you'll hear this termed as underflow between basins or something along those lines. This is a natural component of recharge, or not recharge, excuse me, the opposite of recharge, an outflow, and can be variable over time or can be held constant over time depending on the details and technical bits of each individual model. Are there any questions or comments on this particular item? Krista?
Krista McJunkin from SRP. I know hydrology is not here, but how could a natural phenomenon be the same every year?
So depending on the data that we have available for a given AMA, it might end up being just something that is I think in the previous meeting we kind of talked about mountain front recharge in the same way. In some models, it's held constant. What it ends up being is more of a calibration output, something that's used as a part of the calculation to kind of make the math work in the models. So we don't necessarily think that physically it's constant every single year, but since there's not really a good way to measure those types of things, sometimes it's held constant for the purposes of the models. Any other questions, comments? All right. Riparian Demand is also an outflow component that we get directly from ADWR's groundwater models. I know there has been some confusion in the past about this particular item. This is used to refer to groundwater demands that are due to plants or phreatophytes or other types of natural processes. So again, this particular item may have some variation to it, or depending on the model, it may be held constant. Again, sometimes it's used as a component of the model that helps with the calibration, that is used kind of as a mathematical tool rather than something that's reflecting natural processes, if that makes sense. I'm probably totally butchering that, and I'm sure our hydrologist would characterize that differently. But this particular item, as I said, is a natural component. It does come directly from our groundwater models. Are there any questions or comments about this one in particular? Carlos, do you want to either come to the table or we can get you a microphone? Everyone is welcome, especially Carlos. You'll have to turn your microphone on.
Now it's on. I actually raised this issue in the context of the declaration that the Prescott AMA was no longer in safe field. So this is before all you guys were born, probably 1998 maybe. And the issue that I have is that riparian demand is not it is a use of groundwater, but if you look at your definition of safe field, it doesn't talk about uses of groundwater. It talks about withdrawals. And I've made the argument, not very successfully, that both in the context of underflow from a basin and riparian demand, those are really not factors that should be accorded much weight when you're calculating whether a basin is in safe field. And if you research some of the cases, like from California, for example, you'll find that the definition of safe field is all over the map. There isn't a uniform definition, and if you really push it, it doesn't make much sense because of the issues that I just mentioned. If you're going to protect the environment, you really can't use the definition that's in Arizona law, I don't think. Anyway, that's my only comment. That's why I'm coming here, is to make that comment.
Thanks, Carlos. So we are working with a statutory, as Carlos said, we are working with a statutory definition of safe field. The components that I have listed on the screen previously and that are on the back of your agendas are how we have historically approached safe field. Intuitively, it seems like it would make sense to include kind of these natural outflows because they do reflect a draw on the aquifer, a change to aquifer storage. But I guess I can understand where you're coming from with the statement that it's not technically a withdrawal.
Yeah, my point is that it's not in the definition. It talks about groundwater withdrawals, which implies an active withdrawal of groundwater rather than a groundwater use. I wouldn't have trouble including riparian vegetation specifically, but also the outflows it was limited to groundwater uses. And again, I fought that battle once before, almost 25 years ago and lost. But it just seems to me that when you start trying to balance everything, you're going to have to compromise somewhere. And one of those areas is riparian protection. You cut back the number of trees that suck up all the groundwater, especially shallow groundwater along the San Pedro, and all of a sudden the river starts to run again. So you've got to make a decision or choice between a flowing river and, a bosque. Anyway.
Understood. Thanks, Carlos. And maybe I should clarify here that the calculation here is not any kind of a value judgment on any of these individual components. It's more, this is how we calculate it. This isn't necessarily a policy proposal on how to address it. I wouldn't say that we are suggesting we cut down those trees in order to reduce the riparian demand here. Okay. Krista?
So this somewhat relates back to the inflow, the natural inflow from stream bed recharge.
Sure.
But I think I would ask us to consider whether riparian demand is actually a groundwater demand. Those plants are not intersecting the groundwater table. They're intercepting stream bed inflow, intercepting it before it can become groundwater. So their roots are in the subflow zone, not down, they're not tapping into groundwater. So while it is a draw, I would say it comes out of the stream bed recharge. So however much water is taken up by the plants reduces how much stream bed recharge is happening. And depending on exactly how the stream bed recharge is calculated, it may already have been accounted for because it just intercepts water before it can infiltrate. But it's not another draw on the groundwater table.
So you would say if it hasn't already been included as a portion of the stream bed recharge, then perhaps it should. Okay.
Melody Lawyer, FICO. They also, like in the Tucson AMA, a lot of the riparian areas are maintained by the effluent flows. That is artificial.
So the way we are treating this here is unless that effluent is generating credits, once it goes beneath the land surface, then that is, we for the purposes of the model, for the purposes of our calculation of safe yield, once it's below the land surface infiltrating into the aquifer, that becomes groundwater. So it may have been classified as effluent when it was released, but the legal classification of that water may change depending on where it is throughout that time. Does that kind of make sense?
To a certain extent, but the folks who are taking credits for the effluent also have to subtract off evapotranspiration before they can take any credits at all, and then there's, I believe, still the 5% cut to the aquifer.
Yes, and the cut to the aquifer portion was something that we included on the inflow side. So this particular piece is focusing on the outflow side, kind of the piece coming out associated with riparian uses. Any other questions? All right, Bonnie.
When I listened to your explanation, in order to truly calculate riparian demand, you have to get your arms around how much foliage is out there, what the tree canopies are, and all that, so you can extrapolate from evapotranspiration truly what the demand is. It almost sounds like that this is sort of a catch-it-all area that when the model is run, if things are not coming out when the model is calibrated, then it's just sort of written off to riparian demand.
I wouldn't want to speak for exactly how the modelers treat that, but in some cases it can be used as kind of balancing things in the models, maybe not in all cases. I am not totally clear on the exact data set used there, whether it's actually taking into account like canopy cover, that kind of thing in a given year. But my understanding of this particular component is that it's really just kind of a broad estimate of riparian type uses within the AMA as a whole, and it's not really intended to be a very specific tight estimate on that. It's really more of a broad regional scale type estimate, if that makes sense.
So DWR is not actively measuring canopy area and acreage of vegetation to ascertain a true demand. It's sort of extrapolated.
I believe so, yes. Or I believe we are not measuring that. All right, let's go ahead and move on. So sector demands are going to be kind of our largest components of outflows here. This is kind of your most intuitive portion of groundwater outflows with regard to safe yield. So this is going to be your physical groundwater pumping. This is, again, to kind of remind you all, I know we covered this at the last meeting, but this is a groundwater-focused metric, meaning that water pumped that is not legally classified as groundwater is not included as a portion of these demands. So if someone who is pumping is recovering effluent long-term storage credits, that's not included here. That's classified as effluent. We're focusing on the groundwater portion specifically here. So for each of the sectors, so for agricultural, municipal, and industrial, these numbers come from ADWR's compiled AMA annual reports each year. So annual reports are due March 31st each year. Our AMA staff compile, QA that data, and we then end up using that data on the AMA scale to estimate those total groundwater demands associated with each sector. For Indian demands, since they are not required to report, those demands are estimated based on a number of different, calculated based on a number of different factors. So those are estimated rather than reported. This is an outflow. This is classified as an artificial outflow. It's human-caused. And this is based on actual reported or actual estimated data each year, so you can see that it's pretty widely variable. Any questions or comments here? This one is maybe easy and straightforward, even though it's kind of our broadest and most complicated.
It's also the easiest to understand because you have pumping reports.
Right.
So you just add everything up.
Yeah.
If you can add, you can get an estimate. Unlike the riparian canopy.
It's quite a bit of adding, but yes. Good. Okay. All right. Let's move on to the next one. The next item on our list here is remediated groundwater. So this is a category of groundwater that is included in the calculation of safe yield, but for various reasons, it is not necessarily included it's not necessarily regulated in the same way as groundwater for other types of situations. This is allowable groundwater pumping. It may be legally required under different circumstances if there's a contamination issue or something like that. And this number is compiled directly from our AMA annual report. So this is not an estimate, this is a reported number. Any questions on remediated groundwater? Any comments there?
Melody Lawyer, FICO. Is this, there's a lot of remediated systems that put the water back into the groundwater. I would assume those are not included in this? I don't know if there's a lot. There's some remediation systems where they put the water back into the ground.
After it's cleaned or something like that?
Cleaned. And then there's some that, I know there's one in Scottsdale, there's one in Tucson that puts it into the potable system.
Sure.
And, they do not have to claim that as part of their groundwater pumping.
Right. So the example that I'm familiar with is the Scottsdale example where they do actually reuse that water and report it as water pumped, but it's remediated, so it doesn't apply against some of their other groundwater components. I'm not familiar specifically with any cases where they're putting it back into the ground or how that would be treated, but my guess would be that we would only account for the volume that is not returned. Any other questions, comments on remediated groundwater? All right. Poor quality groundwater is kind of a similar category to remediated groundwater in that it is a different category of groundwater, is still counted against as a portion of the safe yield calculation. This is compiled from AMA annual reports, but this particular category of water is regulated differently than other types of groundwater in the AMAs. Any?
Do you have an example of what that includes?
Not that I can come up with. No, enough, maybe.
So it's not waterlogged. It could be any type of water that is contaminated or in poor quality that is exempt from reporting through the conservation programs. So I believe some of it may be such as mining operations or such, or some other poor quality water that needs to be extracted or can be extracted and is exempt. And it's part of the certificate, so poor quality groundwater would receive a certificate to extract those water, if that makes sense, such as remediated water.
Carlos, can you speak into your, we have a webinar, sorry about that, thank you.
I have a question, but it's not about poor quality groundwater. It's going back to the sector demands, and the question that I don't know the answer to, but it's pretty important to Pinal County at least, is how do you estimate the withdrawals of groundwater by the Indian tribes? Because you don't get reports from them.
So there are a couple different components of those estimates. For agricultural estimates, we look at irrigated acreage and apply an acre foot per acre estimate there. And then for municipal or residential type demands, we look at total population and apply a GPCD, gallons per capita per day, to the population. So it is an estimate, but there is some methodology and data behind it.
It's like in Pinal County, you know, the Gila River Indian community irrigates an awful lot, but most of it, I mean, I don't know the number, but I'm going to guess that way more than 50% of it is with surface water, either CAP or San Carlos. But, you know, if you know, as you know, about the Pinal County AMA model, there's a shortfall there. And if your estimate's off, and they're modeling based on that estimate, you know, that could be a very significant error one way or the other.
So I have not personally created those estimates. I am not totally sure off the top of my head if all of that demand is assumed to be groundwater or if there's a portion that is assumed to be surface water. That's something I can follow up on.
I think that in the case of the GRIC, they have to report annually on how much water they use under their settlement. The tricky part is they don't have to split their use by AMA, and they're in both Pinal and Phoenix. So I think one thing we talked about at the last meeting was just asking them.
Right.
They may not be required to report it, but they might be willing to give us pumping data that was split by AMA so that these numbers could be more accurate.
Right. That's right.
Any other questions, comments?
Thanks, Jessica Fox with AMWA. I was just wondering if you have the individual data sets for the remediated groundwater and the poor quality groundwater. Do you have those? Do you have that isolated?
We do. It'll be included in the data that we post online. We didn't have it graphed out, at least partially because I don't know that we even have any examples of poor quality groundwater, but the remediated is super all over the place and can change quite a bit year to year. So it didn't really illustrate anything, I guess is the point there. So, but that will be a part of the data set that will be posted online, yes. Okay. Yeah, that works. Are there any other questions or comments kind of related to inflows in general? Any other thoughts on how these things should be calculated? Anything we missed with regard to inflows? If you look on the back of your agenda, there's a list of all of the components.
You're referring to inflows, but we've been talking about outflows.
Oh, sorry, I misspoke. Thank you. We were talking about outflows. You're absolutely correct. Thank you for that. So yes, we were covering outflows. Any questions or comments with regard to outflows? Anything we might have missed here? All right, we'll go ahead and move on then. The outflows portion, I think, maybe is because of that reported data, because the biggest chunk here is that reported data. That does make it maybe a little bit more straightforward here, so that's good. So our next steps here are to begin kind of finalizing how we want to move forward with this annual calculation. So I think we had a couple kind of open items from our previous discussion about inflows, and it sounds like there might still be some small things to resolve on the outflow side, but largely what I heard from last time is that the kind of natural recharge components, the portions that we obtain from ADWR's groundwater models, it's probably fine to just stick with those numbers as is. And then the other piece of that would be with regards to the agricultural incidental recharge. We had previously obtained those numbers from our groundwater models, and for the purposes of safe yield, what we've heard is that it probably makes more sense to rather than obtaining those from the models where they are lagged in different ways, it probably makes sense to apply a flat percentage to those agricultural demands to calculate incidental recharge so that it's treated the same as the other sectors rather than obtaining that data from the groundwater models. Somebody?
Part of the agricultural discussion, I think agricultural practices have changed a lot, so I don't know that it's appropriate to apply, just go out there now and say, hey, this is what it is or was 20 years ago. I think that taking a look at and basing particularly rewarding for, enhanced practices in agricultural irrigation practices.
So something we would have to consider as a part of that, so if there is general consensus that we should go forward with kind of calculating the agricultural incidental recharge using a percentage rather than obtaining that information from the model, we would then need to have a discussion of, okay, how do we pick those percentages? So that would maybe be a conversation for another day, but I think we would at least need to acknowledge that would be a consideration for each AMA, and it would probably end up being slightly different for each AMA. Krista?
I agree that some work to look at what the right percentages would be is a good idea, but to your overall idea of taking that out of the model and instead treating ag recharge the same way you're treating municipal and industrial, I think is the right approach.
Anybody else? Carlos?
I got another question from day one. I think I missed the first meeting. I think I had a conflict. But what are we trying to get to? Are we trying to get to a recommendation to the post-2025 group that this is how we ought to treat safe yield? I mean, is there going to be a report that comes out of this? Because that kind of governs the answer to I can't remember her name. Melody. I mean, maybe a percentage is great, but if you need to drill down more, maybe that won't work.
So this particular meeting is related to the management plans work group. So our scope here is the 5th management plan. So this is not a part of the Governor's Water Augmentation, Innovation, and Conservation Council. The council. This is not a part of the council. So what we are kind of working on through this group is consensus and consideration of this annual calculation of safe yield, consensus and consideration around the long-term calculation of safe yield, and kind of considering how we talk about safe yield. How do we communicate safe yield in a way that is clear? How do we communicate progress toward the goal in each AMA in a way that is clear and concise and accurate? So that's kind of what we're focusing on here. Our scope is the 5th management plan. So there will certainly be discussion of the kind of outcomes here in those 5th management plans. But we also intend to adapt an existing conservation program report to include a discussion of safe yield and progress toward the goals as well. So there's an existing conservation report that is currently focused on the municipal conservation programs. We want to expand that to include the other sectors' conservation programs as well as a discussion of progress towards the goal in each AMA. So there will be some reporting and accounting both in the management plans and in that conservation progress report. Krista?
Yeah, to your kind of wrap-up bullet points on the right-hand side, I do a quibble on the natural inputs for inflows. I would like us to look at the stream bed recharge and consider not having that come from the model for a couple of reasons. One, it time lags it in the model, and which makes sense for the model's purposes, but I don't think makes sense for the purposes of the water budget approach for AMA accounting. And then as stream bed recharge and the calculations of how that number is derived interplay with riparian demand and outflows from the AMA, I feel like those kind of are nested. We need a better understanding of how each of those is calculated. So when I say outflows, I mean surface outflows, to make sure that we're not under or over counting those different components. So I would like that one flagged as well.
So maybe that stream bed item is just something we can revisit. My concern with calculating that somewhere else with outside of the model is determining a methodology there. I don't know how we would do that. So that would require some work to, if we were going to separate that from the data outputs of the model, we would have to determine how exactly we were going to do that. So.
Melody Lawyer again, FICO. USGS has numerous, in the Salt River, Santa Cruz River, numerous monitoring points for measuring flow rate. They can tell you how much recharge happens between two different measuring locations, and that's quite common on the Santa Cruz. So basically, does the model include data from USGS that's readily available?
I'm not familiar with the particular data set. My impression was that USGS had stream flow data. I'm not sure about the recharge portion of that. So I know our modeling group does use the flow measurements from USGS, but I'm not familiar with the other portion of that. Any other questions, comments here? No? All right. So it looks like we have a little bit of extra time here. So before I get into this, I'm going to back up a little bit. And I want this one. And let's see if I can get to this page. McKenna, can you tell if that's displaying okay for the webinar? Okay, perfect. Thank you. So this is the AMA data page that I mentioned earlier. This is a previous dashboard that we had posted displaying information about water supply and demand in the active management areas. And as you can see, there's source data and a glossary of terms posted on that dashboard. Below that is our AMA overdraft dashboard, and this will also have source data posted here as well. What you can do on these, if I can get this to cooperate. Oh, normally you can expand these. So I'll double check on the posting of the dashboard, but normally you can expand them so you can see them a little bit easier. I'm not sure why that's, oh, there it goes. So this particular dashboard, we have two pieces here. So many of you will be familiar with kind of the format here showing inflows on the bottom, outflows on top, and the black line in between showing where those two things balance in a given year. This is currently not filtered to any AMA, but you have filters down at the bottom to select a single AMA. What you can do, we also have items down at the bottom so that you can toggle back and forth between this kind of general overview and showing each of these individual components that we've talked about over these last couple meetings. So as I said, the full data set for this will be posted online if you want to look further into the data. But again, this kind of top darker portion is our outflows, our groundwater demands. The lighter bottom portion is inflows and natural and incidental recharge. These types of dashboards are really nice. So we have a number of different filters. So AMA, sector, and component on the bottom. You can also click on the side here, and it'll show you where that individual item shows up in the graph, so you can see that. You can also hover on the graph, and it'll give you the actual numbers behind that portion of the bar. So yeah, so please do feel free to kind of play around with this, check this out. We would love to have any feedback. We'd love to hear how we might better utilize this as we move forward with this group, with changing some of the data, with considering the long-term analysis, that kind of thing. Carlos, you look like you have a question.
Yeah, so what is, I mean, you said it's not, you haven't clicked on any AMA. What's the data that's displayed there? Is that kind of gross?
It's all AMAs aggregated, yeah. So if I click on one AMA, then it just filters to a single AMA.
So riparian's significant. That's the purple at the top, right?
So, whoops. So what we're looking at, if you look at the bars, those are stacked on top of each other. Those aren't total. So the riparian on top is a pretty small sliver. We're looking at... I
think there, like that one, riparian's probably 30% of the outflow.
Oh, no. So municipal, the pink there is municipal. The riparian is...
That's what I want to see.
Here. It's that small sliver on top.
Tiny, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's not going to make a difference in things.
No. So that's the nice thing is you can click on each of these things in the legend to help see where that thing falls. We can also filter by sector. I would point out that the sectors, what you'll see when you click on each sector is going to be the demands from that sector and then incidental recharge from that sector. We have not assigned any of the natural components of recharge to any given sector because they're not associated with any given sector. That is something we've kind of heard a request for, is figuring out a way to divvy that water up and kind of not allocate it. That's not the word I want to use there. But assign it differently to each sector for the purposes of calculating safe yield, seeing how each sector kind of fares with regard to safe yield, but that may have to be its own conversation in the work group at some point of how we might approach that. We've taken a couple initial stabs at it and are realizing that there's a lot of different ways to do that. So, any questions?
Well, so the light green up there,
the light green is your incidental recharge. The darker green is your agricultural.
But did I understand you to say that the light green is all incidental recharge, or is that just, so that's everybody?
This is just agricultural incidental recharge.
Okay, but I thought you said there wasn't a way to break that out.
So we haven't split out natural recharge by sector. So the incidental recharge we can assign to a single sector, but the natural components of recharge, mountain front recharge, stream bed recharge, that kind of thing, we have not determined a way that we might assign that by sector at this point. Okay. All right. I'll just exit out of there and switch back here. Okay. So I've mentioned this a couple of times throughout today's meeting. We do have a couple kind of outstanding items before we fully wrap up the annual calculation. Excuse me. Before we fully wrap up our conversations about the annual calculation of overdraft or safe yield. But we would like to start having some conversations about that long-term analysis associated with safe yield. So as I pointed out earlier, the statutory language includes both a mention of the annual calculation and of assessing whether it's a long-term balance between groundwater withdrawn and recharged. So we want to kind of look at that long-term balance thing. How do we look at long-term? How do we define long-term? How do we analyze long-term in each AMA? without kind of masking progress toward the goal in any given AMA. So that'll be what we start to discuss in our next upcoming meetings. I think there's a lot of different ways that we can approach that. So I really hope that you all will dig into this data a little bit. I hope that we'll be able to have a full conversation about that. We are really looking for ideas here, and I think that kind of sourcing things from the community is maybe going to be a good way to get some ideas here. I won't pretend I have all of the ideas here. So we are really hoping that this is kind of a collaborative thing going forward, looking at how we might analyze this. Obviously, it would be nice if we could analyze it the same way in each AMA, but it's also possible that there's not a single best analysis that works for all of the AMAs. We've seen some of those differences in our initial analyses, trying to look at those long-term trends. So we are really looking forward to getting into that part of the conversation. I think it'll be really interesting. Are there any, there we go. We do have a couple additional meetings coming up. We have an ag meeting on March 3rd. There is a municipal sector meeting for the 5th management plans on March 9th. And then we have a full work group meeting on the 19th. So that work group meeting is largely going to be updates from the individual subgroups. We've been making a lot of progress in the individual subgroups. So I think that'll be an interesting meeting. And a good time to kind of bring everything together. So we're looking forward to that. And we will probably get another Safe Field technical meeting on the calendar after that full work group meeting. Are there any other questions or comments before we close out here today? Krista?
A little off topic, but could you give us a status update on the 4th management plan, like where we are in the process? I know there was the hearing. Sure. I just don't know. I don't remember the 3rd management plan.
Let me go here. So 4th management plans. We held a hearing for the Phoenix AMA 4th management plan on February 10th. And our statutory requirement there is that we issue findings within 30 days of that hearing. So we are currently working on those findings, and we'll be issuing them in the near future. After the findings are issued, we would then issue an order of adoption and would notice all of the water users in the AMA of their conservation requirements. So those conservation requirements would then go into effect on January 1st, 2023. That's for the Phoenix AMA. So Phoenix AMA hearing was in February. We are going to be publishing a draft of the Pinal 4th management plan, the Pinal AMA 4th management plan, in the next week or two. So that is coming very soon here. And then we'll go through a similar process for the Pinal 4th management plan, taking it to the GUAC, having some stakeholder outreach, and then moving into the adoption process for that. We will also be publishing a 4th management plan for the Santa Cruz active management area. That will be coming, I believe our target for that was late spring. Excuse me. So our intent for those remaining 3 4th management plans is to have all 3 of them adopted by the end of this calendar year. So a little bit of a tight timeline there, a lot to do with that, but adopting them all by the end of this calendar year puts all 3 of those plans effective on January 1st, 2023. So a lot coming with that. But for Phoenix specifically, we are anticipating that plan, that the final adoption would be sometime in the next couple months here.
When do you think the letters to the water users would go out? Like this year?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So so there is a statutorily required noticing event associated with that final adoption of those plans. So that happens kind of at the same time as the final adoption. Any other questions, comments, things before we close out? Jessica?
Can I ask a question that backtracks quite a bit? When you talked about the agricultural, municipal, and industrial sector demand coming from the annual report, isn't there that portion of municipal of the demands from exempt wells that is an estimate?
Yes.
And are there other estimates in the other sectors like that are involved that aren't just, I mean, I know that's based on reported populations and all that, but are there any other estimates within those other sectors that aren't outflows that don't just come from the annual report?
I'm trying to think through the sectors. I don't think so. The exempt estimate is based on population on those exempt wells. So kind of similar to what I talked about with the tribal demands, it is based on, there's a calculation there. It's not just kind of a stab. Yeah, so there's a calculation there, but it is an estimate. Okay, I can't think of any other categories that had estimates associated with them. I think the rest of them were reported data. Okay. All right. Well, we will go ahead and close out then. We do very much appreciate you all being here today, participating in this process. We know working through each of the components like this can be a little bit dry, but it's necessary as we kind of find consensus, at least on this annual portion, and try to move forward with this process. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you for your feedback and participation, and we hope we will see you all soon. Thanks.